Hello, everybody. We're going to get started now. Can you hear me in the back okay? Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Odlum, and on behalf of Arlington Public Library, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program presented in partnership with Encore Learning. Encore Learning has been a valued partner of Arlington Public Library for many years, providing enriching educational opportunities for lifelong learners in our community. It's actually been almost 5 years to the day that Encore Learning moved to a virtual format due to the pandemic. While we've enjoyed collaborating virtually over the past 5 years, it is truly wonderful to gather in person once again. There's something special about sharing ideas and discussions face-to-face, and we are delighted to welcome all of you and those of you who are still online today, to welcome you back. Today, we are honored to host historian and author Rebecca Brenner Graham, who will share insights from her book, Dear Miss Perkins, a story of Frances Perkins' efforts to aid refugees from Nazi Germany. This powerful and deeply researched work brings to light the extraordinary contributions of Frances Perkins, the first female U.S. cabinet member, and her humanitarian efforts during one of history's darkest periods. Her legacy of advocacy and action is a timely reminder of the impact that individuals can have in shaping the course of history. We are grateful to Dr. Graham for joining us, to Encore Learning for their partnership, to One More Page Books for providing copies of the book for sale in the lobby if you're interested, from the Friends of Arlington Library who fund all library programs, and to all of you for being here and online to engage in this important conversation. One housekeeping note, please silence your phones. Following the presentation, which is being live streamed and recorded, we will open the floor up to Q&A, and Dr. Graham will be available to sign books at the conclusion of the event. Now, I would like to introduce Louise Kenny, who leads the special events team at Encore Learning. The Encore Learning Special Events Group focuses on identifying speakers and topics that will be of interest to its members as well as to people in the greater Washington community. This team also organizes in-person tours for its members. Please join me in welcoming Louise Kenny, who will introduce Dr. Graham.
Hi, everybody, and hi. And thank you to Jennifer very much. We are, on our side, the Encore Learning, we're thrilled to be partners again, too, and to seeing each other in person. And, you know, Zoom gets kind of old, don't you think? So, although I do welcome everybody that's listening on Zoom, too. So, well, welcome to March. This is March 3rd. I'm 2 days late, but welcome to March, and this is a National Women's History Month, if you were not aware of that. Women's National History Month started out as National History Week with Jimmy Carter in 1980, and he designated it. And then 7 years later, it turned into a whole month because there's more to talk about than a week's worth when it comes to women. So how appropriate is it that we have an esteemed woman here, Dr. Graham, who's going to speak to us about an esteemed woman from the past. We're glad to tie in with National Women's Month like that. Dr. Graham is a postdoctoral research associate at Brown University, and she also taught at the Madeira School and at American University. She holds a PhD in history, and an MA in public history. You'll have to tell us the difference when you get up here. In 2023, she was awarded the Cokie Roberts Fellowship from the National Archives Foundation and a Rubenstein Center Research Fellowship with the White House Historical Association. So she's well-versed in history and this topic in particular. Her writing has also been featured in the Washington Post, the Times, Slate, Ms., and the Los Angeles Review of Books. She focuses on Frances Perkins, and I've read her book in preparation for today, And it's so interesting, not only about her, Frances Perkins, but about the situation that she encountered when she came in and became the first Secretary of Labor. And then, and at that point, the immigration was under that department, so she became very versed in that. And she was quite creative in how she could move things along quicker, and that, of course, helped refugees. So she was quite the woman. I do want to remind you, we will have questions and answers at the end, so if you can hold them till the end, and we'll set up a microphone and you can come up here. And with that, I would like to introduce Rebecca Brenner Graham, Dr. Rebecca Graham.
Thanks so much to the Arlington Public Library for inviting me. Thank you to the Encore Learning team for partnering with us. By us, I mean, I think of myself as part of the Arlington Public Library just because I'm a library card holder here. And thank you all so much for being here. Happy Women's History Month. I'm going to start today's presentation by reading the introduction from my book as an introduction to today's talk. That way, I won't forget to include crucial details to understanding the rest of the story. On the night of November 9th, 1938, Nazis burned synagogues, looted Jewish homes and businesses, raped Jewish women, and deported Jewish men to concentration camps across Germany and Austria. The night of broken glass, Kristallnacht, made headlines around the world, including in the US. For many Jewish people, that night marked the first time that they truly wanted to leave their homes forever. For others, it increased their resolve to seek refuge. In the U.S., the agency that might be able to help them, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, was under the Department of Labor, which was headed by the first female cabinet secretary in American history, Frances Perkins. At age 58, she wore a tricorn hat and pearls. She was a white woman with dark eyes and dark matronly clothing. Her handbag and heels stood out under the cabinet meeting table and surrounded by men's shoes. She slept in a single bed because her husband was in a psychiatric institution, but her personal life was off limits to anyone outside her minuscule private circle. Perkins habitually felt others' pain as her own, and refugees were no exception. She had a flurry of ideas, mostly good ones, all of which had been in motion before 1938. The ideal course of action would be expanding U.S. immigration quotas, the numerical caps that dictated how many people born in each country could immigrate per year. But because those numbers were controlled by Congress, that seemed unlikely. She proposed mortgaging quotas, combining both 1939 and 1940 allotments into 1939. She supported adding an additional quota for child refugees to offer children a chance at a safe life. If Congress would not adjust quotas, she suggested a separate quota for the American territory of Alaska to settle Jewish refugees there. Could the U.S. be a refuge to oppressed people? Did it want to be? Could it overcome its own prejudices to be the golden door? All refugees whose lives were in danger counted as immigrants under the same quota laws as other foreigners seeking to relocate. Perkins had helped shepherd radical New Deal legislation, the Social Security Act of 1935, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 through Congress. Could she do the same with refugee policy? These questions kept her up at night. The morning after Kristallnacht was the morning before Armistice Day on the 20-year anniversary of the end of World War I. Americans listened to Kate Smith perform over the radio a new song composed by Irving Berlin to mark the occasion. The original first verse of the song, God Bless America, was, As the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that's free. Let us be grateful that we're far from there as we raise our voices in a solemn prayer. Musical tones from the accompanying instruments then bounced into a vivacious God Bless America. Let us be grateful that we're far from there as we raise our voices in a solemn prayer. As a devout Christian, Perkins was undoubtedly praying, but unlike most of the country and most of the government, she tried to translate those thoughts and prayers into actions. At what point would rising Nazi atrocities awaken the U.S. from its post-war isolationism? How might Americans care about the welfare of non-citizens, especially while struggling through the poverty and scarcity of the Great Depression? Contemporary myths of immigrants taking American jobs and resources date back to the 1930s and farther. Quote, I am a rat catcher in Boston for 20 years. I can show you 500 alleys in Boston with 100 children ages 5 to 8 in these alleys. These children are in bad need of care, so take care of kids at home first, end quote. An American citizen wrote to Catherine Lenroot, head of the Children's Bureau in Perkins's Department of Labor in 1939. The question of how to share resources with refugees when citizens lacked resources might have seemed well-meaning enough until he signed off, quote, are you taking orders from the rich Jews, end quote. On November 18th, 1938, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt announced via press conference his willingness to extend the tourist visas of 12,000 to 15,000 German Jewish refugees already in the country. Perkins had the idea for these extensions in 1933. Following a cabinet meeting in spring 1933, a State Department official journaled about a phone conversation in which the State Department had tried to explain immigration to the Labor Secretary. He wrote that Perkins quite blew our poor undersecretary off his end of the phone. Perkins claimed that it was an American tradition to help people seeking asylum. By 1938, however, Perkins's tone had shifted. Quote, a great many people seem to hold the belief that there is some provision in the immigration laws for political refugees or for making this country an asylum for the oppressed of all nations. This is absolutely not the case, she wrote to a correspondent. Between those two different claims from Perkins, she'd come face to face with the antithesis of her highest American ideals when anti-New Dealers in Congress tried to impeach her. For her role in protecting an Australian immigrant and labor organizer, Harry Bridges, Perkins faced an impeachment hearing, hate mail, bad press, and even anti-Semitic slurs from conspiracy theorists claiming she was Jewish. She handled the accusations of Jewishness with grace, publicizing a letter expressing that she'd be proud of her Jewish heritage if she had it, which she didn't. But overall, the impeachment experience shook her. Nevertheless, she persisted through a combination of relaxing visa requirements, reducing deportation numbers, devising the corporate affidavit for businesses to finance refugees, and collaborating with the German Jewish Children's Aid Incorporated on a robust child refugees program. Perkins contributed to saving the lives of tens of thousands of refugees from Nazism. By the time initiatives that she'd set in motion reached Congress, however, any political capital that she once had was in shambles because of the impeachment ordeal. These efforts to accept refugee children and create a German Jewish settler colony in Alaska failed in 1939 and 1940, respectively. Both ideas crossed Perkins's mind and materialized in scribbles of notepaper across her desk. The Alaska Plan signified a rare instance when American colonization and imperialism could not prevail above all else because the anti-Semitism toward those who would be settling was too strong. Perkins navigated an American climate of anti-Semitism, capitalism, misogyny, xenophobia, and more. Her positionality as a Christian, educated, relatively privileged descendant of English settlers made her encounters even more unsettling and stark. As a historical figure, she's a unique tour guide for contemporary readers interested in the history of the U.S. in the 1930s. As an American governmental official, she offers the lens into American responses to the German Jewish refugee crisis prior to World War II. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt later moved the INS from labor to justice in 1940, ahead of America's entrance into World War II, because Perkins's immigration policies were too progressive. This story is easy to miss. Myths have persisted to obscure it for too long. 60 years after her death, Perkins continues to be relatively unknown. Keeping a low profile was partially her own doing, and the men who wrote first and second drafts of history through journalism and scholarship didn't need to be asked twice to downplay her role. Further, ideas about American immigration history are still recovering from the melting pot myth of American cohesion and happiness. And that leaves historical memory of Nazism and the Holocaust in the American collective consciousness, which has taken a tumultuous journey all by itself. Uses and abuses of Holocaust memory in fiction, politics, and more are endless. As a result, the first female cabinet secretary, a quirky fun fact, the U.S. as a nation of immigrants, an American moralistic outrage, and resolve to never forget and never again might seem like three separate strands of history. In truth, they converge in a singular story. That is the introduction. I am not as good at reading it as my audiobook narrator, Tanya Eby. If anyone's an audiobook reader in here, I am. I listened to hers. It was awesome. Let's see. Oh, the PowerPoint's back. Thank you for your work over there. Raise your hand if you had heard of Frances Perkins before signing up for this program. Yeah, that's what I thought. And she had a lot of interaction with this region as well. But I have spoken, this is, I think, my 16th or 17th book talk since publication last month. And many audiences have a much lower rate of having heard of her. There we go. So she was born in South Boston in 1880. She later told people that she was born in 1882 so that she would not be perceived as older than Franklin D. Roosevelt. She moved to Worcester, Massachusetts with her family when she was 2 years old in 1882. She attended Mount Holyoke College in Western Massachusetts, where she graduated and was class president in 1902. While she was there, she had a history professor named Anna Maysole require students to visit the mills in local Holyoke, Massachusetts. That was the first time that she experienced the poor working conditions of immigrant communities. And after Mount Holyoke, she moved to Chicago, where she could not get a job in social reform work like she wanted, so she taught high school science. And on the side, she volunteered at Hull House, the new settlement home founded by Jane Addams, and I always forget Jane Addams's co-founder's name. Does anyone know? I should really learn the co-founder's name. So Jane Addams and her co-founder created Hull House to provide not only food and shelter to people in need, but also entertainment, education, and a sense of community. So Perkins, as a volunteer, was part of that. Hull House strengthened her resolve to work in the new social reform field, and that propelled her move back to the East Coast, where she worked with similar movements in Philadelphia before moving to New York City to pursue a master's at Columbia University in an innovative combination of politics, economics, and sociology. So while in New York City and working for the National Consumers League, Frances Perkins found herself across the street in 1911 from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The workers had complained about working conditions. Their bosses had not listened to them. And Perkins and many other passersby unfortunately witnessed people dying. She later described the Triangle Fire as the day the New Deal was born, but it really strengthened her resolve to use policies to protect marginalized communities from the social forces that threatened their well-being. After the fire, she was appointed by former Governor Theodore Roosevelt to a statewide committee that would investigate fire safety and other workplace conditions across the state of New York. From that position, she was nominated by Governor Al Smith of New York to his industrial commission for the state of New York. She was good at that job. It involved intervening in the mediation of labor disputes and also on workplace safety conditions. Frances Perkins then was a natural choice for let's see, what was the title? It was essentially Secretary of Labor for the state of New York. Oh, Industrial Commissioner. They called it Industrial Commissioner. So under the new governor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, she served in that move. and in that position. And that is why when he won the presidential election in 1932, he appointed her for a wide range of good reasons to become U.S. Secretary of Labor and the first woman cabinet secretary. But let's put a pin in Frances Perkins' story for a second and rewind to a parallel story that is also necessary context. Her lifetime was basically the duration of the period when explicitly racist laws governed immigration to the U.S. She was 2 years old when Congress passed the first law that explicitly banned nationality of laborers from coming to the U.S. That was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, banning Chinese laborers. In 1917, Congress expanded that to what it called the Asiatic zone, meaning laborers from all Asian countries, and also barred people with mental and physical disabilities from immigration to the U.S. In addition to that, it also had a clause called the LPC clause, short for the likely to become a public charge clause, and that will become important in a minute. In 1924, there was new immigration legislation, the National Origins Act of 1924, which set quotas of how many people could immigrate from each country to the U.S. per year. And it used late 19th century census data as well as racist pseudoscience to calculate how many people from each country. The Congress wanted to exponentially increase the demographics already present in the U.S. So the quota for England was very high. The quota for Germany was actually quite high because of white German immigrants during the 19th century. And that's why the likely to become a public charge clause was actually what was barring them. And in Eastern Europe, the numbers were much lower. In other countries, like for example, Asian countries, really all other countries, it was 100 people per country per year. I was teaching high school history when I wrote this book, and I used to tell my students that's fewer people than are in this building right now. Not sure how many people are in Arlington Public Library right now, but it might be more than we're allowed to immigrate from Korea to the U.S. between the National Origins Act and then the Immigration Act of 1965. But that was after this period. So for the duration of Frances Perkins' life, the National Origins Act was the law of the land. Including in 1933, when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January. The Roosevelt administration started on March 4th, 1933, slightly over a month before the Nazis attained power in Germany. The Nazi Party had formed after World War I, when Germany had lost, and the victors had blamed Germany for starting the war, basically for everything, and penalized them heavily. That threw Germany into an economic disaster even before the Great Depression started. And so what the Nazi Party platform stated as early as 1920 was that Jewish people would not count as citizens, and that the citizens of Germany, well, they would be able to, their livelihoods would be able to accelerate and elevate, and Germany would expand and make more room for them and more resources for them. So it was almost like a Marxist revolution, except instead of overthrowing the governing or elite class, it was overthrowing the Jewish people in Germany. So that's what the Nazi Party set out to do well before it attained power. The Nazi rise to power was both gradual and all of a sudden. They tried to overthrow the government in 1923 and were unsuccessful. Hitler was not even a German citizen at that point, but he was not deported. He was allowed to stay in the country with a light prison sentence, where he wrote Mein Kampf, explaining his ideology. We know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt read it in the original German, and it was widely read by educated people. I mean, not to agree with the Nazi ideology, but just because it was a widely circulated book that made clear what the Nazi mission was. So that means that when the Nazis came to power in 1933, there was an immediate influx of applications from Jewish people in Nazi Germany to immigrate to other places. In March 1933, when Frances Perkins became Secretary of Labor on March 4th, there was a lot going on. One of those things was a national banking crisis, which was chaotic, and one of her ideas to solve the economic down spiral was public works programs. So she really had a lot on her plate. But the first time that she walked over to the Department of Labor, which is not where it is today, I think it was on G Street, an immediate concern was that several different men told her that they were in charge of immigration. So there was a bureaucratic inefficiency problem, but also the Department of Labor had been allocating its resources to deport people. There was a federally funded mob known as Section 24 that would raid immigrant communities and deport people. That's why immigration was in the Department of Labor, because those people viewed deportation as a means to protect American jobs. So even though Frances Perkins came to Washington to initiate New Deal labor programs, one of the first things that she had to do was she asked the president for an executive order to combine the Immigration Bureau with the Naturalization Bureau to create the Immigration Naturalization Service, the INS. So she consolidated authority, reformed the system. She did things like create rooms for social workers to have physical space to advocate for immigrants at Ellis Island. And she also made it so INS employees had to apply before arresting an immigrant. And that would come back to haunt her a little bit and had to do with her impeachment hearing. At the same time, she had a friend named Dorothy Thompson, who was a journalist and was the first American to write about the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany for U.S. audiences. And Dorothy Thompson gave Frances Perkins an understanding of what was happening in Germany. This was almost 10 years before the Holocaust. There were no death camps yet, but inability to support themselves and their families due to Nazi laws was an existential threat to Jewish people and families. So, Frances Perkins came prepared to a cabinet meeting in April 1933, ready to point out that the Immigration Act of 1917 said that the Secretary of Labor may accept charge bonds on behalf of a refugee. That was a sum of $500 put up by an American citizen and deposited into a postal savings bank to ensure that the immigrant in question would not become a burden on the U.S. economy. The State Department immediately objected because the State Department controlled visas before the immigrant in question was in the U.S. The Labor Department, the INS specifically, controlled visas after the immigrant was already in the U.S. And President Roosevelt did what he usually did when two cabinet secretaries disagreed. He threw it to a third cabinet secretary. So the Attorney General, Homer Styles Cummings, was tasked with deciding, could the Secretary of Labor use charge bonds for refugees? And he decided that she could. So that was an early victory by Frances Perkins for refugees in the Roosevelt administration in January 1934. However, by the following summer, she had not used a charge bond yet. The reasoning was twofold: a fear of anti-Semitic backlash that her advisors warned her about, and also she needed to appease key political allies, such as the labor movement, which had the white male trade unionist labor movement had been historically anti-immigrant, and she needed the support of places like the AFL and the CIO for New Deal legislation in Congress. However, that victory in the charge bonds controversy gave Frances Perkins some political leverage, and also the victory spread by word of mouth. It really was not covered in the press to her broader networks, including Jewish communities, including a woman named Cecilia Rozovsky, who was also in Perkins's woman-led social reform circles. But she herself was a poor Jewish daughter of working-class immigrants. Cecilia Rozovsky actually grew up as a child laborer in an overalls factory. But by this point, Cecilia Rozovsky created a new organization called the German Jewish Children's Aid Incorporated, and she served as its executive secretary. Rozovsky and her colleagues at the GJCA came up with a new plan to use charge bonds for specifically child refugees. She thought that children would be more sympathetic, that they would not upset the anti-immigrant political operatives or anyone who might escalate anti-Semitism. So she went ahead with this plan, proposed it to Perkins, had a series of meetings with Perkins and her commissioner of immigration. And then one day in summer 1934, Rozovsky was in DC for a meeting with Perkins's labor department. The person who was supposed to meet with her was not there, and it turned out there had been a switch. And the State Department was objecting to the use of charge bonds. I mean, they couldn't really do that because the Attorney General had sided with Perkins, right? But basically what the State Department said was that they would be okay with issuing visas to child refugees. So child refugee policy does come directly out of the charge bonds controversy through that story. But charge bonds were not actually used for child refugees. Instead, the State Department was willing to give them visas through the political leverage that Perkins had gained. So here began a child refugee program through Rozovsky's German Jewish Children's Aid. It saved several hundred lives, not quite 1,000, but almost 1,000, from 1933 to 1941. When America entered World War II, it became something else and survived in a different form. But the partnership between the GJCA and Perkins's Department of Labor lasted for almost a decade. It was a partnership between the GJCA, the INS, and then also the Children's Bureau in Perkins's Department of Labor. So the Children's Bureau was really the one looking out for the welfare of the children. But Cecilia Rozovsky, she was the one, and the people who worked for her, who were personally canvassing Jewish communities to find homes for the child refugees. They would greet the refugees when they arrived at Ellis Island. They would, what else did they do? They corresponded with an agency in Germany that would help select the refugees based on who was most in need to seek refuge. So the names on my slide are the names of the first 9 refugee children who arrived in New York in November 1934. They happened to all be boys. There were also many girls. They just happened to all be boys in the first ship. Sometimes the ship would only carry one child, and that was representative of the spirit of the program, that they believed each life was worth saving. I was not able to trace the story of every single child refugee, but traces of some of them are available to us. For example, on this slide, Herbert Weschler, his younger brother, Joseph Weschler, came 2 ships later, and he has an oral history that's publicly available on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum website. Joseph Weschler, the younger brother, 10 years later actually fought in World War II. I think he was 9 when he came here and 19 when he enlisted in World War II. Their parents did die in the Holocaust, and their parents corresponded with them for 10 years before that happened. So that's just one of many, many examples of this child refugee program. See, I might be pressing the wrong arrow here. There we go. Okay, so when the child refugee program started in 1934, there was also a successful strike of dock workers on the West Coast. You might be thinking, what the heck does that have to do with refugee policy? Well, I think Frances Perkins might have been thinking that too. But basically, there was a communist immigrant man from Australia named Harry Bridges who immigrated to the U.S. in 1920. In 1934, he led a successful strike among the dock workers, and it was successful, but it did not provoke extensive backlash until 1935, when the National Labor Relations Act, which Perkins worked on heavily, provided a legal mechanism for strikes and unions in the U.S. Then it upset the anti-unionists. And the backlash snowballed for many years. This is when there was a conspiracy accusing Perkins of being Jewish. Basically, her husband's name was Paul Wilson, common name. A different man named Paul Wilson had married a Russian Jewish immigrant named Matilda Watsky. So the conspiracy theorists said, well, she must be secretly Matilda Watsky. That was a real thing that happened. And it just snowballed until February 1939, when she had to sit through an impeachment hearing. And that date is important because the following summer, 1939, there was a bill in Congress to expand child refugee policy. And she could not testify because at that point she was seen as a political third rail on the issue of immigration. The following summer, there was a bill to set up a new quota for German Jewish refugees to move to Alaska, which is complicated in itself. But by the time that bill, the King-Havner bill, reached Congress in summer 1940, she had been thinking of that idea 5 years earlier. She had written to the Secretary of the Interior about it in 1935. But by that point, she no longer had as much political capital as she did at the end of the charge bonds controversy. One other point, with an eye on the clock here, but one other point I want to make about the impeachment testimony, partially because I have an essay about this in Time Magazine on Tuesday, and I just think it's really relevant, is that when she had to sit through a resolution to impeach her, she told Congress that if Congress made a law that you had to deport someone for being a communist, she would follow it. She told them that if the Supreme Court decided that being communist is grounds for deportation, she would follow it. But neither of those things had happened. She was, in some ways, like very traditional. She approached the implementation of laws pretty traditionally, and her point was that she was just following the law, and that's really the spirit of her immigration policy and her policies. She was trying to work within the system to reform the system. She was not saving people left and right. She was not breaking the law, and that's why Congress could not impeach her. They could not impeach or convict her. The charge was treason because they equated supporting a communist with trying to overthrow the government. And she didn't really support the communists. She just required the INS to apply before arresting them. So she was not impeached, but again, it had concrete effects on her political capital and what she could do next. But once again, many events were unfolding at the same time. And this whole time, while she was working on the child refugee program, as the ships continued to arrive, as there was a resolution to impeach her, this whole time she was receiving a series of letters from people that she knew from all stages of her life and career who were asking her to intervene in individual refugee cases. They're housed in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, which is the picture on the slide. One example that comes to mind is her dentist's cousin was trapped in Hungary. Her dentist, this man, Eugene Weisman, literally wrote to her, "I've had the pleasure of performing on your teeth." But his cousin, Andre Verity, was born in Hungary, lived in Austria with his wife and children, and was stuck on a 10 to 12 year wait list for the Hungarian quota. He needed to come in on the Hungarian quota because that's where he was born. The National Origins Act specified that it was the nationality of the man of the family, right? Because it's also misogynistic. And So Andre Verity was able to immigrate to New Zealand, actually, but his case is representative of many people who were not able to immigrate and find refuge. And there are so many other cases, and I highlight several in chapter 7 of my book. The Alaska idea was the one that I mentioned that came to Congress in summer 1940. Basically, after it became clear that Congress would not expand the quota system even for children, there was an idea to have a separate quota for Alaska, which was a colonized territory. And I argue in chapter 8 of my book that only through understanding Alaska as a colonized territory can we see that this was part of the thrust of American imperialism, which typically got its way in U.S. history. And only then can we understand the true force of the xenophobia and anti-Semitism that stood in the way of this plan. So once again, the impeachment testimony was in 1939. And the following year, 1940, in May, Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Congress to move the INS from the Labor Department to the Justice Department for 3 different reasons. One was backlash against in connection with the impeachment ordeal. It was popular among many American voters to remove immigration from Perkins's department because of the Harry Bridges saga. A second reason was connected, which is that in 1940, President Roosevelt was running for a 3rd term. No one had won a 3rd term before, and he needed all the support he could get. Third, World War II had started in Europe in September 1939, and although the U.S. had not entered it, moving immigration from the Labor Department to the Justice Department was seen as part of preparing for war, part of making immigration a more rigid policy and less progressive as it had been under Perkins. The INS had eaten up a lot of Perkins's time and energy. I think it was quite onerous for the Labor Department. Perkins opposed the transfer, not because of herself, not because she wanted more work for herself and her department, but because she opposed moving it out of the civil realm and into the Department of Justice. That meant that the same people charged with implementing immigration policy at the Justice Department would also be responsible for deciding controversial immigration cases. So that was why she opposed the transfer. But in my book, Dear Miss Perkins, the transfer does mark most of the end of her chance to help. Occasionally, she would still put a word into the Department of Justice. One example of her putting in a word to the Department of Justice, and the anniversary of the Sound of Music, by the way, was like yesterday. It came out in 1965, the movie. Okay, but I'm getting ahead. In 1940, she personally intervened in the Von Trapp family singer's immigration case in the spring of 1940, and then again in the fall of 1940 after it was in the Department of Justice. Their mutual contact was named Gertrude Ely, who lived in Pennsylvania. She was one of Perkins's closest friends, and she just happened to know the Von Trapps from their singing tour. I use this case study in chapter 10, both to show who could immigrate to the U.S. and who could not, right? Because the Von Trapps were not Jewish. They had a wide circle of influential contacts. They had many privileges going for them. The Baron von Trapp was even born in a part of Austria that counted as Italy because of borders changing after World War I. And I also use the Von Trapps chapter as a transition into my last 3 chapters, which are about historical memory relating to this story. The historical memory of the Nazi era and the Holocaust in the U.S. has taken a tumultuous journey all by itself. In the 1960s, when the Sound of Music delighted viewers, the American audiences were really not ready for Nazi and Holocaust narratives that center Jewish perspectives, right? It's a movie where the third part of it is Nazis chasing people out of Austria, and there's no presence of Judaism or Jewishness in the movie. Of course, in Jewish communities at the time, they were really remembering the Holocaust already, but for the majority of the American public, they just weren't there yet, and that was its own story of historical memory. Immigration policy had a key moment in 1965 when immigration legislation abolished the quota system. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed it symbolically under the Statue of Liberty. Since then, immigration policy has privileged people with family already in the U.S. and people with jobs already in the U.S. So in many ways, immigration to the U.S. is still very, very hard to do, but it is not based on an explicitly racist quota system. So since 1965, there have been many examples in popular culture and media of the U.S. as a nation of immigrants. One popular one is the Great American Melting Pot from Schoolhouse Rock. Raise your hand if that song will be going through your head now. Okay, good. Not too many of you. When I was writing chapter 12, it was like in my head constantly. And that brings us to the final chapter in my book, Remembering Frances Perkins, which goes through how she did publish a memoir in 1946 where she attributed her accomplishments to Franklin D. Roosevelt, right, because she was working for him at the time. And the reason she knew so much about what he did is because she was working on it. And then in 1965, she died, and we do get a glimpse of how she wanted to be remembered by the biblical quotation that she wanted to be in her eulogy, which was, "Be ye steadfast." That was also from her speech as class president at Mount Holyoke in 1902. In 1980, there was a small flurry of Frances Perkins' historical memory. That year marked the centennial of her birth, and there was a postage stamp for her, and also the naming of the Frances Perkins Department of Labor building downtown by President Jimmy Carter. But when Dirty Dancing came out in 1987, the character Baby does say that she is named, quote, Frances, after the first woman in the cabinet. And the people who wrote the movie remembered Frances Perkins, but by that point in the 1980s, audiences probably saw her as little more than a quirky fun fact. Until 2009, when journalist Kirsten Downey was on a bus tour of DC with out-of-town guests, and the tour guide cracked a misogynist joke. He said that Perkins was in labor for 12 years. And that motivated journalist Kirsten Downey to pursue her own 10-year research journey. She published The Woman Behind the New Deal in 2009, which was the same year that the Frances Perkins Center started in Maine. I argue in chapter 13 that in order for a historical figure to rise in prominence, they need both a compelling narrative and an institutional home base. So after 2009, Frances Perkins had those two things. Since 2009, there have been many moments in national politics that provide a context for remembering Frances Perkins. A lot of thinking and talking about the first woman to do things, whether it was the first woman nominee for a major party presidential ticket in 2016, the first woman vice president in 2020. I call March 4th Frances Perkins Social Media Day because all of those people post about Frances Perkins on March 4th. Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, sometimes Billie Jean King. So feel free to keep an eye out for that. And most recently, in December 2024, President Biden did designate the Frances Perkins Center in Maine to be a national monument. And so Frances Perkins is currently a moral icon on the rise. And in many ways, she can also provide an antithesis to the contemporary moment of American politics. Thank you again for being here and listening, and I look forward to engaging with your questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Rebecca. Is it on? Can you hear me? You said March 4th is her day?
Yes.
That's tomorrow, everybody. So can
Oh,
you
that's
please
tomorrow.
post
Yeah,
something
today is Monday. So
on,
March 4th, 1933 was
Okay.
when she took the oath to become labor secretary.
So you all have an assignment from this being here today. Could you please post something about her online? And we would invite everybody to come up for questions. Here's a microphone here, and we'll certainly engage Dr. Graham on this. And also, if you're on Zoom, please also type in a question, and we'll include your question here as well. I have a question to kick us off. What made you become involved or interested in her?
When I was a junior in college over a decade ago, I received an email from the Mount Holyoke Career Development Center with a subject line, Paid American History Internship in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was and is the only place I've ever wanted to live. And I sprang from my dorm to the Career Development Center to ask how to apply. I applied. I got the internship, which was funded by the Francis Perkins Center, facilitated by the Mount Holyoke Archives and Special Collections, and located at the home of author Kirsten Downey in Old Town Alexandria outside of Washington, D.C. The project was organizing Kirsten's extensive photocopied research for a donation to a combination of the Mount Holyoke Archives and the Francis Perkins Center. And while I was working on that, I came across just a photocopied scholarly article about Francis Perkins's refugee policy by historian Botany Zucker. It was from the early 2000s. And Kirsten mentioned to me the letters at the National Archives at College Park and how there was really a story to be told there. That became my senior thesis a decade ago. And then I did my PhD on a different topic, if anyone cares about postal history. I mean, people might if the post office ends, but hopefully that doesn't happen. And then after I finished graduate school in summer 2021, I thought that I was going to pursue my dissertation as an academic monograph. However, a few weeks later, I found myself instead pursuing a trade press book for wider audiences, commercial publication on the Francis Perkins's refugee policy topic. And I think that's because I like engaging with smart people who are interested in Francis Perkins and immigration policy and on American responses to the Holocaust. They're three interesting, engaging, important, relevant topics in my biased opinion. And that was just what I wanted to spend my time and energy doing. So thank you again for caring about the topic.
Oh, good, thank you. I'm reading your book, and can you say a little bit about her personal life and how difficult that was?
Francis Perkins married, I think, for love when she was in her early 30s. There was one letter where she wrote to her mother-in-law saying, like, thank you for raising her new husband and that she'd take good care of him and loved him. Her husband, Paul Wilson, had struggled with bipolar disorder before there was much treatment at all. He had had a breakdown when he was an undergraduate at Dartmouth. He had gone home to Chicago, where he graduated from the University of Chicago, and then started a life in New York politics, which was where he met Francis Perkins. A few years into their marriage, there were a few incidents that contributed to him essentially losing the battle to his illness. One was that one of his bosses in New York politics did die by suicide, and after that, it really led to his down spiral. He cheated on Francis Perkins around that time. She was going to divorce him, but then she found out she was pregnant, and she was actually quite conservative and traditional in many ways, and she was not going to divorce him if she was having a child with him. So their first child actually died in childbirth, and then she had their only child, Susanna, and so she found herself married to Paul Wilson, raising her little daughter, Susanna. And while Susanna was little, Paul Wilson became unable to work because he was too ill. Once again, there really was not effective treatment for his illness, and so he was institutionalized for the vast majority of their marriage. She was the breadwinner for the family. As a historian, I try to stick to what the documents say, based on the documents, I really feel that what Frances Perkins wanted in her life was a conventional, stable marriage, and that she would raise her child and pursue her social justice causes wholeheartedly on the side. She did not have the privilege of doing that because she was responsible for supporting the family. So that's how she found herself working full-time in New York state government. She happened to be really, really good at what she did. And when the newly elected President Roosevelt appointed her to be Secretary of Labor, she initially told him no. And one of the reasons was because her husband was institutionalized in New York. Her young daughter was still in high school in New York, and it was disruptive to the family's routines for her to move to Washington, D.C. But she did, and she commuted back and forth, and she took care of everyone.
And her daughter also had some mental problems too, didn't she, Susanna?
I think Susanna seems like a lot of fun. Like, Frances Perkins might not be the most delightful coffee date. I imagine that Susanna was. And Susanna actually did grant oral history interviews to author Kirsten Downey in the early 2000s, before Susanna died in the early 2000s. Susanna also struggled with bipolar disorder, which is genetic. She graduated Bryn Mawr College. She married a couple times. The second time she married, she had a son, Tomlin Coggeshall, who actually just died last month. Absolutely wonderful person. He was a founding member of the Frances Perkins Center in Maine and has worked to preserve the legacy of Frances Perkins.
Right, thank you. You have a question?
I'm just wondering if you were able to find much about the confirmation hearings for her. I mean, and was there sort of overt sexism discussed and talked about, and how solidly was she confirmed? Thanks.
At the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, there are many letters that he received in reaction to the appointment. Franklin D. Roosevelt had such an overwhelming electoral mandate that all of his cabinet secretaries were confirmed. One of them, I think it was the Attorney General, actually died shortly after being confirmed, but there was no problem with her confirmation. However, he really received a lot of letters in response. Many of them were enthusiastically supportive from women's groups. Many of them, including from the trade labor unionists, were not supportive. They had been used to seeing a rank-and-file labor union leader as the Secretary of Labor, and she was not. She was from a broader women's labor movement. And so that was one reason for the backlash against her appointment. And then increasingly throughout her tenure as Secretary of Labor, as she was a key architect of New Deal policies, he continued to receive even some hate mail, and they would use misogyny against her to protest the policies that the administration did together.
Thank you. Yes.
About, 8 to 10 years ago, my book group read Kirsten Downey's book. And I would be curious, I don't remember there being much on this topic in it. Can you kind of compare the two books? And did she maybe suggest that you do something like this, or just, anyway?
There are two chapters in The Woman Behind the New Deal about refugee policy. The first one is called Rules and Regulations. It's about the charge bonds controversy. And the second one is called War Clouds and Refugees. And it's about the extension of visitor visas and then the transfer of the INS. When I interned for Kirsten in 2014, she did suggest this topic to me. She was very supportive throughout my senior thesis process back in the day. Most recently, I saw her in Hawaii over Thanksgiving. She lives in Oahu now. Our approaches are very different. I think she's a better writer than me. She's a journalist and just has such an elegant style. I'm a trained PhD historian, and my book is not a biography. It's a narrative nonfiction about policy history that's sometimes marketed as a biography. One other detail I wanted to mention here is that another significance of the Von Trapp's chapter is when Kirsten originally told me about the letters at the National Archives at College Park. She told me that when you hit the Baron Von Trapp's business card, that's when you know you're in the right place. So even when I returned to those documents years later, It was just reaffirmation that I was in the right place.
Okay.
Another thing I learned from Kirsten that I might add, she was the one that told me that when there's like a random coincidence, it's a sign from the universe that you're doing the right thing.
There's a scene in The Power Broker when Robert Moses and Frances Perkins are looking over what I guess was flats on the west side. Can you talk a little bit about their relationship?
I have not read The Power Broker. The book I've read by Robert Caro is Working, about his writing process of producing The Power Broker. Many people have told me that she is in it because she did work with Bob Moses under Al Smith's administration. I mean, chronologically, that was when Frances Perkins was on the state's industrial commission. She was not industrial commissioner yet. And then Frances Perkins did stay on with Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, whereas Bob Moses did not. But yeah, I've heard that she's in The Power Broker. Would you recommend it as a read? Raise your hand if you've read The Power Broker. All right, well, I have my reading cut out for me. Thank you.
After she left the administration, FDR's administration, did she have a post-administration career?
She had asked to resign several times, and Franklin D. Roosevelt had said no. When he died, in spring 1945, she started writing her resignation letter. She stayed on a couple months into the Truman administration, but she was never trying to stay longer. She did work for the Civil Service Administration, as that was called. She worked in civil service for the Truman administration, and she did that until her husband died in the early 1950s. And then she became a professor briefly in Illinois and then at Cornell. She was always struggling with money because she was responsible for her husband and then sometimes for her daughter. And so at the very end of her life, she actually lived in a college boys academic fraternity where they gave her free room and board as an honor. That was the last step of her career.
Wow. And she died in 1965? Is that what she said?
Yes, she died of a stroke while at a routine doctor's appointment.
Oh.
If you were born in 1880 and died in 1965, I'm not good at math, sorry.
85.
Yep, and it was after her birthday, so 85.
Wow. Any other questions? Okay, come on over to the microphone.
We'll use the microphone because people are online, but thank you.
You mentioned in the beginning of the book that she used practices when she went into the Labor Department where she fired a large group of employees. How do you reflect on that with what's going on now?
I don't think she fired employees.
You did say fired.
I did not say fired.
Right.
There's a great article on this by political scientist Neil Hernandez in the Journal of Policy History. It's called Against the Grain. She used creative tactics of implementation. So she doesn't make the laws, but when Congress makes a law, the executive branch is tasked with implementing it. So what she did was she would let allocated funding run out, and then they would not have jobs. So she did that with Section 24, which was the part of the INS responsible for raiding immigrant communities and deporting people.
Thank you. Question? Yes.
Do you have a sense of how many women were employed in the Labor Department when she was the secretary? Or did it, over time, were there more women employed, and what was the timing of that?
Thanks for asking. I don't know the numbers, but I do know that many key positions were filled by women, and not just secretaries. I mean, she had a personal secretary, Miss J, that she was very close to, who was a woman, but also the Children's Bureau and the Women's Bureau of the Labor Department were led by women. They had been before Perkins. Actually, the only The only Labor Department employees who congratulated, from the Hoover administration, who congratulated Perkins on her appointment were the head of the Women's Bureau and the head of the Children's Bureau, and they were both women. I don't know who the head of the Women's Bureau was, but the head of the Children's Bureau was Grace Abbott. And then when Abbott left, the new head of the Children's Bureau was Catherine Lenroot, who worked directly with Frances Perkins and also with Cecilia Rozovsky on the child refugee program. But there are many, many women's names in the personnel files. I just don't have an exact number.
Thank you. Yes.
Just a quick question. How did the Frances Perkins Center end up in Maine?
Frances Perkins's family lived in Maine before the U.S. was a country. She was directly descended from settlers in the 7 Years' War. And then, I mean, some of her family lived in Massachusetts as well, but both of her parents were born in Maine and then moved to Massachusetts. So her grandparents always had a homestead in Newcastle, Maine, which is the national park site now. And she visited it frequently throughout her career, including when she found out that World War II had broken out in Europe. She had to take a train back.
So is that where the memorial is, in Newcastle, Maine?
Newcastle, Maine. It's called the Frances Perkins Center. They have education programs and museum exhibits. It used to be a nonprofit, and it still is, but now it's also a National Park Service site because President Biden designated it as so in December.
Thank you. Yes.
Was there any kind of informal political alliance between Eleanor Roosevelt and Frances Perkins?
Absolutely. Their political priorities were nearly identical. Frances Perkins was closer to Franklin Roosevelt than to Eleanor, but they were friends. One key moment where I think Frances Perkins felt very supported by Eleanor Roosevelt was Perkins's roommate and best friend, Mary Harriman Rumsey, died early in the administration, and Eleanor Roosevelt sat next to her at the funeral as a sign of support from the Roosevelts. But yeah, I mean, Eleanor appears in Frances Perkins's correspondence all the time. Sometimes she was the person referring a refugee case to Perkins. What I think that someone should write a book on, that I am not going to write a book on, is comparing their pretty parallel career tracks. Because Frances Perkins came into political influence through her full-time work that she took on because she was required to be the breadwinner for her family. Eleanor Roosevelt came into political influence because she married the most charismatic political figure of the era. And I do think it's telling that the way that Eleanor Roosevelt came into her influence was, while it absolutely received pushback, was generally more accepted than Perkins's. And I think that has a lot to do with why Eleanor Roosevelt left the administration with her full political capital intact and Frances Perkins did not.
Thank you.
So what's your next book on?
I'm writing a book on the American Revolution through popular culture from 1976 to the present. 1976. So it's basically where the American Girl doll universe meets the 1776 to Liberty's Kids to Hamilton pipeline. And I'm teaching a class on that topic in the fall at Brown University.
And you live here in
I currently live in Providence. I lived in Arlington for 6 years, including the whole time I was writing Dear Miss Perkins. This is home. Providence is not home, but I do live there.
We look forward to you moving back here.
Thank you.
Oh. Any other questions? Well, in the beginning when I introduced Dr. Graham, I said this is an accomplished woman talking about an accomplished woman. And I think we learned about you, and I think we learned about her. So thank you very much.
Thanks to Encore Learning.